right. Good to see everybody here this evening. Do you see that bar going up for the audio? Okay, good. Thank you. I knew a little 5-year-old girl back several years ago, and she did not like that song at all. I'll Fly Away, because it says, you know, when I die, I'll fly away, and she couldn't grasp the overall message of the song. It made her really, really sad that she started to cry. I felt so bad for her, and you just can't hardly explain that to a 5-year-old. But the song even though it mentions death and flying away, there's a great message of hope for the Christian there in that song. All right. I am going to do some troubleshooting with this mic here later on. See if I can figure out exactly the source of the problem. But I think we are beyond wanting to hear any more static from that wireless mic. So we're going to go to this one right here. And as long as I'm standing right in here, it picks up my voice. But if I go over here, going back and listening to the lesson from last Sunday evening, when I got over here like this, it started to drown out pretty quickly, or over here. So if you see me venturing from side to side, just do this. Okay? But I'll try to stay pretty much in one spot here. What a delightful afternoon it has turned out to be. Nice weather, drop in the humidity. Hopefully that will stick around a few days. All right, but hope you've had a great day today, and want to encourage you to take your Bibles, and as we get ready to study God's Word together, we want to begin a brand new letter, and this is the very last one in this whole series. And it is the letter to the church of the Laodiceans in Revelation chapter 3, beginning with verse 14 and continuing through verse 22. I think I mentioned the fact when we ended last Sunday that this letter is a doozy. It is quite different in its tone and tenor from the other letters. There is a lot of significant things about what Jesus said to this church, and we're going to bring these things out. We're going to highlight them. And brethren, I'll be very upfront with you here at the beginning. This is not a pleasant letter to study. It is really depressing. But there's a reason why it's in our Bibles. Right? The Lord expects us to learn from its contents, as well as all the other churches of the churches of Asia Minor. If you will remember, they were to read each other's letters. Hear what the Spirit says to the churches. We've talked about that. So the same thing is said here to the church at Laodicea. This afternoon, now I've studied this material many years ago and have presented it before in class, and I've kind of, throughout this whole series of studies, I've just kind of gone back over my previous notes, but I really wanted to start fresh, like I had not studied it before. I found out, though, that with this letter, that my convictions, some of the conclusions that I drew way back then are still the same convictions I have, because the language is just, you can't get around it. And you may be asking, well, Brother Ben, what are you talking about here? Well, we'll get to that. I'll mention that here in just a moment. It is a sobering, just a very sobering letter that we need to take the time to explore. All right, we're going to follow the same general outline that we've been following for the other churches. And I'm going to go ahead and give you this, if you want to take notes on it. First of all, we talk about the city itself, and that is in verse 14. And then you have the church there in verse 14 as well. The Christ in verse 14. And next you have the condemnations. Yes. Verses 15 through 17. And you have the council, verses 18 through 22. You see that okay? Is it large enough? Doesn't it make it any bigger? Let me do this. All right, that helps out a little bit. All right, but you still have to be able to read my writing. If you can read my writing, I think you'll have it made. All right, so the city, the church, the Christ, the condemnations, and the council. You notice any other C word that we've used in previous studies that are missing? Let me get back over here. She's pointing. Get back over there. That is missing from this letter. It's the opposite of the condemnations. The commendations. Jesus did not commend this church for anything. And that is a very significant thing. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. All right, let's talk about just a few facts. And these are, even though they are a few facts, they are fascinating to think about. And as they relate to the language that Jesus uses to this church. And this was characteristic of everything in all of these letters, and how Jesus would use language that they could relate to on a physical level, and then make the spiritual application. First of all, the city itself. It was located about 75 miles southeast of Philadelphia, 105 miles east of Ephesus. As a matter of fact, I have a map here. Let me bring it up for you. Let's see if I can get this map to come up. All right. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Oh, yeah, that's looking a lot better there. How's that? Pretty good? Okay. I need one of those laser pointers because I can't actually draw on this particular page. So you can see how they are numbered, starting down there with Ephesus, which is the church that we started with. That's number 1. And then it goes around to where we are at now. Number 7 is Laodicea. So you have Ephesus, number 1. Number 2 is Smyrna. Number 3 is Pergamos. Number 4, Thyatira. Number 5, Sardis. Number 6, Philadelphia. And then again, number 7 is Laodicea. You have some other cities that are on that map that are also in Asia Minor. And we're going to have some things to say about them here in just a few moments. By the way, I told AI to make this map for me. I said, can you make me a map of the 7 churches of Asia, all of the churches that were in Asia Minor, not just the ones in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. That's what it gave me. Isn't that pretty? That's pretty fascinating, isn't it? So we'll go over some of the other aspects of this map here in just a moment. But getting back to the city itself, there were many temples erected here in Laodicea, including a temple for emperor worship. That was characteristic of many cities that existed in the Roman Empire. Not all cities had a temple erected for emperor worship. It was a big deal if you did. Not in a good way, though. There was said to be a very famous school of medicine that was not actually in the city of Laodicea itself, but about 13 miles from it. And so, due to its close proximity, it was very influential to the city itself. It is said that this school developed an eye medicine, which became widely used and added to the fame and the popularity of the city. Now, Jesus said something about that on a spiritual plane there in verse 18, where he says, "Anoint your eyes with eye salve that you may see." So again, that is something that they could probably relate to on a physical level. But Jesus makes the application in a spiritual sense. Also, the city was very famous for its breed of sheep, which produced a very soft and glossy black wool used to make highly prized and widely sought garments. Again, this goes back to something that Jesus said that they could relate to there in chapter 3, verse 18. He says to buy white garments that you may be clothed, which was, of course, white being the opposite of black. So it takes on a spiritual significance. He says that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed. One thing that is, this is a fascinating bit of information that I came across. And no doubt it has to do with what the Lord's saying about them being lukewarm. So one thing in particular about the city of Laodicea is that it lacked a fresh water supply. So the water had to be piped in from hot springs over a 6-mile trip. What is that? I guess what is that where water travels through? Aqueduct, yes. And yeah, thank you. So it finally arrived to the city where it was said to be, guess what? Lukewarm. Lukewarm. And it is said, read this, don't know how true it is, but it sounds good based upon what Jesus said. It is said that those who drank the water would get sick from it. So that may explain why Jesus used that terminology there, "I will spew thee out of my mouth," there as he talks about in verses 15 and 16. So those are a few facts about the city itself. Any comments on that before we move on to the church? All right, so remember, as we've studied through these letters, out of these 7 churches of Asia, only 2 of them are mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. Ephesus is mentioned a whole bunch in the New Testament. We spent a lot of time looking at that. And the second one is here in Laodicea. All the others are mentioned only here in Revelation. So just Ephesus and Laodicea are mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. And it is also interesting to note that the other times in which Laodicea is mentioned in the New Testament is only in the book of Colossians. And we want to take a look at those passages. So keep your place here at Revelation chapter 3 and turn back to the book of Colossians. And we want to take note of these verses here. And I will put these on the screen. Colossians chapter 2, verse 1, is the first place that we have Laodicea mentioned, where Paul said, "For I want you to know what a great conflict I have for you," you being Colossae, "and those in," where? Laodicea. "And for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh." So there is a reference to Laodicea. Nothing is said about it, either good or bad. It's just that it's referenced here. And that is the way we find it in the rest of these passages in the book of Colossians. The remaining ones are in chapter 4. Look at chapter 4 and verse... hold on just a minute here. Yeah, not verse 3, chapter 4, verse 13. Chapter 4, verse 13. I'll just go ahead and put the rest of these up here. Verse 15 and verse 16. Verse 13 says, "For I bear him witness." This is Paul speaking here, of course, and the him is referring back to verse 12, Epaphras, who was a servant of Christ, and he labored fervently for the church at Colossae. But he says, "I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you," you being the church at Colossae, "and those who are in," here it is again, Laodicea. And then another one is mentioned, "and those in Hierapolis." So you have Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis mentioned there in one verse. Verse 15. Paul said, "Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and Nymphas, and the church that is in his house." So evidently the church there met in his home. Verse 16 says, "Now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea." All right, now that's an interesting thing that Paul says there in Colossians 4, verse 16. Again, notice what it says. He says, when this epistle, he's talking about this epistle that we are reading now, that we have in our Bibles, the book of Colossians. So he says, when this is read among you, that is in the church, in the assembly, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans. So the church at Laodicea would also hear the contents of the book of Colossians, even though it was specifically written to Colossae. But he says to this church at Colossae, he says that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. Now, do we have that epistle in our New Testaments? Laodicea? No, we do not. The only thing that is, we don't have a standalone book. The only thing that we have would be what? Revelation chapter 3. And the verses there, verses 14 through 22. But that cannot be categorized as an epistle. It's just a short letter. So evidently Paul had something else in mind there that the church at Colossae would read. Again, he calls it the epistle from Laodicea. So they would read each other's epistle. Now, doesn't this completely parallel what we've already looked at with these 7 churches of Asia? To every single church, what did Jesus say at the very end? He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to, how many times we emphasize this? To the churches. So all the churches would read each other's letter, just like we see right here in Colossians 4, verse 16. Okay, now here's the practical thing about that, brethren. These epistles, these letters were intended to have a universal application. So it wasn't, an epistle wasn't just for only one congregation. So, since that is the case, what do we have today? Do these epistles apply to the church in the 21st century? Yeah, you better believe it. These inspired epistles, the reason why we don't have the epistle from Laodicea in our New Testament is evidently because it was not an actual inspired epistle. You got a question, Mark? Absolutely. Nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There can be church cooperation, but we have to remember that the church, that is on a local level, is still autonomous. That is, the eldership of another church can't tell another church what to do. You can seek out advice. You can, consult other people and get their thoughts on what the Bible teaches. So absolutely nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, we have plenty of examples of that in the New Testament. Great question. Great question. Okay, let's move on to something else here. Well, not really to something else, but maybe from a different angle. Let's go back to this map. All right, so do you see Colossae? Let me see if I can make it just a little bit bigger for you. You see Colossae down there? It's just right below Laodicea. What is right above that? Colossae. Hierapolis, right? Did we just read something about Hierapolis in Colossians 4? Yeah. And then Colossae itself. Those were two other churches that were in Asia Minor. But we don't have any letters in the book of Revelation, do we? Written to Colossae or Hierapolis. So when I think about that, you have 7 letters in the book of Revelation. Obviously, the number 7 is not to be taken literally, because there were more churches. Rather, the number 7 simply stands for completeness. All right? What are some other cities there that you see mentioned? Kind of in the top left over there. Get away from the mic. Troas. Does the New Testament say anything about a church in Troas? Yes, it does, in the book of Acts. I can look at my map. I don't know why I'm looking over here when I can look right here. You guys got to keep me straight. And then, if you go kind of almost straight down, there's another city with the purple dot. What is that one? Miletus. Now, it is here, there's a little reference box there on that. Paul called the elders, the church at Ephesus. By the way, when I told AI to make this map, I didn't tell them to put all these extra things in there, like Paul called the elders, the church at Ephesus to meet him there. I didn't say anything about that, just added it, which is a nice touch, right? But you find that in Acts chapter 20, verse 17. And then the same with Troas. There you have a reference to Acts 16, verse 8. So here are some other cities and other churches. Now, I don't know if there was an actual church in Miletus. I don't believe the New Testament speaks of an actual church in Miletus. He just called for the elders in Ephesus to meet him down there. That makes sense? Now, you may want to look that up. Google that, see if there was a church in Miletus in the New Testament. If I'm wrong, let me know. But I don't recall reading about church in Miletus. I could be wrong about that, though. If I am, please correct me. Yeah. Well, that would be an assumption. It wouldn't be an implication. We would just assume that could be the case. Yeah. Remember when Paul, there in Acts 20, when he called for the elders to meet him down in Miletus, he was in a hurry to get back to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, if you kept going east, he was in a hurry to get back by Pentecost. He didn't have time to travel back to Ephesus, so he had the elders to meet him there for a very important meeting that you can read about in Acts chapter 20. All right, let's see what else this map reveals. Down here at the bottom, you can see the approximate distances between these 7 churches. We've mentioned that as we went along here. Okay. Here's something we want to get into. Actually, we've already hit on this by the question that Mark asked. And I'm glad you asked that question, because it's going to tie in to what we want to discuss next. All right, so let me go to a brand new page here. All right, let's put... I'm going to make 2 columns. Well, I ain't got to make 2 columns. We'll just put these up here. Church at Colossae. And you have the church at make sure I spell this right. Laodicea. Now, how far was, go back to my map, how far was Colossae from Laodicea? No, it doesn't give the distance there, unless it's, let me see here. I don't see it. But it was just a few miles. You can see it there. It's just a few miles. It wasn't very far from Laodicea, so it was very close proximity. Colossae and Laodicea. Now, when you read the letter to the church at Colossae, which is the book of Colossians, okay, where we were just a moment ago, it's only 4 chapters. From all indications, this was a faithful congregation. Now, when Paul references Laodicea back in these verses in Colossians, he just mentions them. He just mentions this church. He doesn't really say anything good or bad about them. Now, I don't know exactly how much time there was between the writing of Colossians and the letter to Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3. But it doesn't really matter, because by the time we get to Revelation chapter 3 and read that letter that Jesus sent to the Laodiceans, they were so far gone. Now let's get back to this. The church at Colossae. From everything that we read here in the book of Colossians, they were a faithful congregation. Doesn't mean they didn't have any issues. Paul addresses a few issues that needed to be corrected, but by and large, they were a faithful congregation. Now, they had to deal a lot with what was, and really all the churches at that time had to deal with what is known as Gnosticism. It's just another religion that sprung up during that time in the first century and carried over to the second, third centuries as well. But going back to that map, Laodicea was just a few short miles south or north of Colossae. And yet, this congregation was what? Unfaithful. So, why didn't, being in such close proximity to one another, why didn't the unfaithfulness at Laodicea affect the faithfulness at Colossae? Okay, they were strong in the faith. That's exactly right. And it goes back to something else. A very important pattern about church government and organization that we read about in the New Testament. And it's this: every local congregation was autonomous. Just because one congregation across town, just so to speak, was unfaithful, did not mean the other congregation would also be unfaithful. Now, autonomy or autonomous simply means self-rule or self-governing. That is, each local church governs itself. We just mentioned this a moment ago with the question that Brother Mark raised. You know, even though you can consult another eldership or preacher or whatever, that congregation or that eldership only oversee and govern the affairs of that local congregation. They cannot do that for another congregation, the church, another church across town. That would violate church autonomy. Now, what we see in the religious world today is a violation and a departure from the original pattern of church government and church organization. So that what we have today, by and large, not in every case, but by and large, this is the rule. You have some type of earthly what? Earthly headquarters where edicts and decisions are made, and these are passed down, let's just say, Church A, Church B, Church C. So when they pass down edicts and decisions, do those decisions affect just one congregation? No, it affects all of them. So when something gets handed down, let's say from Rome, who does that decision affect? Everybody. That's not what you read about in the New Testament. There's no such thing as an earthly headquarters. So if Church A becomes unfaithful or they make a decision, that has nothing to do with these other congregations. Not unless they choose to go that route. Now, it is certainly true that sometimes, and I've seen this happen a lot, that area congregations have a way of influencing other area congregations, especially those area congregations that may be more prominent, may have a lot larger membership. They can influence other congregations, which is sad that happens, but it does. And so what we have, getting back to, the church at Colossae, the church at Laodicea, just because Laodicea made bad decisions, that doesn't mean the church at Colossae had to go along with it, right? Why not? Because of autonomy. The way, and this is the wisdom of God and how He set up and organized the church. Wisdom, the wisdom of God in how He did that. So that if, one church makes a decision, it doesn't affect all the other churches. That's autonomy. That is self-governing. All right. Let's see how much time we have. Just a few minutes. I asked ChatGPT, which is AI, some questions about the church at Laodicea. Here's what I said along these lines. I wrote, "It is in the wisdom of God that the church was established as autonomous in nature. This differs from religious systems that operate through centralized earthly headquarters where decisions affect every congregation. In the New Testament, the apostasy of the Laodiceans did not automatically affect the church at Colossae." Here's what AI said in response to my observation. "The New Testament presents Christ as the sole head of the church, with local congregations responsible before Him. Churches shared doctrine and fellowship, but each congregation was individually evaluated by Christ. Revelation chapters 2 and 3 demonstrates this principle repeatedly as Christ addressed each church according to its own works and condition." Well, AI is smarter than a lot of real people. It's amazing. All right. We'll get into this a little bit more here as we look at the church itself. Go back to Revelation chapter 3. Let me see if I can. All right. Go back to Revelation 3, and I want you to notice how this church is immediately addressed in verse 14. So notice what it says. "To the angel of the church of the" who? Laodiceans. See, I don't know why it's a hard word for me to write. Church of the Laodiceans. That's not the same formula or the way that Jesus addressed all the other churches that we've studied so far. Go back to chapter 2. Verse 1. The church at Ephesus, right? Look at chapter 2, verse 9. I'm putting all this here so you can see the difference. The church go back to the church at Ephesus. I have on the screen, what do I have? The church at Ephesus, it says the church of Ephesus. And then in verse 8, the church of, or in where? All right, Smyrna. And if you come down to, let's see where we're at, verse 12. The church in where? All right, church in Pergamos. Verse 18. The church in Thyatira. Chapter 3, verse 1, the church, all right, church in Sardis. And verse 7, church in Philadelphia. All right. What's the difference here? Well, if you notice, and I don't want to make a big deal out of something I cannot prove, but it is striking to me why the change. Every time Jesus addressed a church, he mentions the city, doesn't he? The city itself. That is, the church that was located in that city. To the church at Laodicea, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say to the church of or in Laodicea, does he? What does he say instead? The church of the who? Laodiceans. Why the difference? Well, based upon my study of this letter, I think there's a reason why Jesus styled that differently. The church of the Laodiceans, that is, the church belonging to the Laodiceans. Kind of see where I'm going with this? Well, here's what I'm thinking. Based upon, and we'll get into the contents of the letter later, but what Jesus said later on indicates to me that he had already withdrawn fellowship from them. He had already removed the candlestick. Because he is pictured as being on the outside of the church. All right? Now, we're going to have a whole lot more to say about that. But Jesus no longer recognized this church as belonging to him. And so hence, therefore, my study judgment, the change in terminology, the church of the Laodiceans. Now, I want to add this little caveat to that. Back in the book of Colossians, chapter 4, can't remember what verse, I think verse 16, it is also called the church of the Laodiceans. Now, were they an unfaithful church when Paul wrote Colossians, and therefore called them the church of belonging to the Laodiceans? I don't know. Again, nothing good or bad is said about the church there in the book of Colossians, like it is in Revelation chapter 3. All right, I may have confused you on that. We'll get into it a little bit more next time because our time is gone. But I think once we start to dig into some of these things of this letter, you'll see why I'm drawing the conclusions. You don't necessarily have to agree with the conclusions, but I believe you'll see why I'm drawing those conclusions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can't get over the language that Jesus used there in verses 19 and 20, especially verse 20. I had back many years ago, a preacher, we were looking at this together, and he said, Ben, I believe that Jesus had already withdrawn his fellowship from this church. He'd already moved the lampstand. He no longer considered them church belonging to him. I said, what makes you draw that conclusion? Verse 20. I said, that makes a lot of sense. And I asked AI about that too. I'll tell you, it's something very revealing that it revealed to me. I will reveal next time. Okay, we're going to stop right there. A lot of interesting things about this letter. Again, it is quite different than the other letters. And even though it is a depressing letter, to be honest with you, we can definitely learn a great deal from what the Lord expects and what He demands of His church, and the way back home to Him if we have fallen away. All right, and so thank you so much for your very kind attention. Appreciate it, as always. But we do want to offer the invitation here tonight if you need to respond, and if you need prayers of your brothers and sisters in Christ, we will certainly accommodate that at this time. As together we stand and as we sing.